Okay, we did it. We finished off Romans. This week, we looked back across the entire letter and sort of gathered up all the context to see the movements that Paul is making in this letter. And guys, this is a big accomplishment. It took us 5 years. It took us about 30 sermons, keep coming back at it year after year. And now we were able to put all of those things together in context. Now, if you missed the sermon, we'll put a link down below. Check it out. I think it's really important to see what Paul is doing in the context of the city of Rome and in the context of how all the parts of Rome work together. But I want to hit on one of the things that we talked about quickly on Sunday. We addressed a couple of years ago in the series, but I want to bring it up here again, and that is the new perspective on Paul. Now, there's another video about the new perspective. I'll put a link down for that below if you want to hear all of the exposition of what it's talking about there. But the key that we looked at on Sunday was this idea of justification. And in the past, one of the dominant ways of reading Paul since about the 16th century was the idea that we are justified by our faith in Christ. The new perspective on Paul re-looks at all of that, looks at the language that Paul is using in some of these passages, particularly in Romans, looks at the context of the Greek genitive construction here, and says that actually probably a better reading of this would be that we are justified by the faithfulness of Christ. Now, both of those work in the context of translating Greek, but here's why which we choose is important. So, you're not in trouble because of what Adam did. You're in trouble because the world around you is broken. And it inevitably pushes you in all kinds of unhealthy directions. Now, why that's important is because that leads us into Paul's concept of justification. We are justified, or we are made right, or we are healed through the faithfulness of Jesus. Now, often we talk about our faith in Christ. So does Paul. That is super important to him. But salvation begins in the faithfulness of Jesus. Jesus, who does not follow the way of Adam, who refuses to be corrupted by the world around him, and therefore, in the words of Paul, just as one trespass resulted in condemnation for all, so also one righteous life, Jesus' life, has resulted in justification and life for all. But all of that depends on the second reading of this justification, that we are justified in the faithfulness of Christ. Now the question is, does that mean our faith in Christ doesn't matter? Well, no, that's a mischaracterization, almost somewhat of a caricature of the new perspective on Paul. Of course we need faith in Christ, but salvation begins, it has its genesis in the faithfulness of Christ. Because before you and I can have faith in Christ, we have to have something to have our faith in, and the something we have our faith in is the faithfulness of Christ, who completes what a human should have been, who refuses to go down the path of Adam, and who creates for us a new humanity so that Christ can be the firstborn among new brothers and sisters, a whole new humanity who would leave aside the way of Adam and choose the way of Christ. See, this is sometimes the mischaracterization that we have of the new perspective of Paul, that we are downplaying our faith in Christ as if we don't have to have a faith position, we don't have to put our trust in Jesus. Well, of course we do. The question is simply what we are putting our trust in. And what we are putting our trust in this perspective, is not just the fact that Christ died, but everything about the Christ story. That Christ is incarnated within the human experience, that Jesus is fully human even though he is divine, that he lives a life worthy of that status, that he lives a fully human life that lives up to everything a human should be because of his divine nature. He doesn't sin, he doesn't fall short, he doesn't go down the path of Adam, that he gives his life away willingly. He allows himself to be a scapegoat and a sacrifice where we direct all of our anger, all of our frustration, all of our need to villainize another at him. And then, even at that critical moment, he forgives. He chooses not to pay our violence back with violence. He forgives it. He says they don't know what they're doing. They don't understand why they have this drive to scapegoat me, and I forgive them. And then he is resurrected. This divine stamp of approval on everything that Jesus was in the incarnation and his life, this divine acknowledgement that Christ's life was everything he said it was. But this is what we're putting our faith in, Christ's faithfulness to be true to the story of God. And that's what Paul is getting at Romans, that God is revealing God's self to be against everything that hurts us in the world. All of our sin, all of our godlessness, all of our wickedness, God is against all of that because God is for us. Understand this. The anger of God, the wrath of God it is never against you. It is against everything that hurts you, including the sin within you that leads you to hurt the person beside you. And so God sends Jesus. Jesus lives the life that the Christ was meant to, which means there is now a new humanity in the world. A humanity who can put their trust in the faithfulness of Jesus, who can believe that the life of Jesus really is the life that humanity was meant for. Then Paul argues that this was always the story from the very beginning, even when we didn't see it, that God has predestined to choose all of us. Remember, he's talking about groups of people here, not individuals. The tricky part with this section, and what trips a lot of people up, is that they come to this passage without having read everything that we've just talked about. And if you do that, you're going to read language like called and predestined and foreknew, and you're going to think, what does that mean for me? That's because you live in a culture that has trained you to ask, what does this mean for me? That is not how a Jewish rabbi like Paul thinks. That's not what Paul is doing here, because Paul is not talking about people. He's talking about peoples, remember? So it's not God foreknew you, but not you. God called you, but not you. It's God called the Jewish people. And that story, since Abraham, was always predestined to expand to include all peoples. All nations would eventually be chosen and invited in, and now we get to live out of that. We live the story of Jesus, the Spirit in us and through us as we put our trust in the faithfulness of Jesus, and we now learn how to live together, welcoming each other, accepting one another, learning from each other, and filling out our imagination of who God is. But this is the key. You can't have faith in Christ until you believe and you trust in the faithfulness of Jesus. That everything that Jesus has done in the incarnation, in his life, in his death, in his resurrection, that this is what a human life was meant to look like, that this is the divine at work in the world in Jesus. And when you put your trust in the faithfulness of Jesus to do good for you, to meet you, to choose you, to come and find you and bring you back home, then your choice meets God's choice, and the fullness of everything it means to be a follower of Jesus in the way of Christ takes root inside of you. So this week, understand that your Christianity begins not with you and your choice. It begins with the faithfulness of Christ, who comes looking for you, who came looking for all of us, who lived out the choice, the chosenness, the predestination that God had always planned to choose every single one of us. And now your choice is whether you will respond to all of this. But God has already loved you. God is already on your side. God is already choosing you right now. The question is whether you will respond and how you will lean into everything that God is doing and will do for you one day. Romans has been a lot of fun. I hope you've been able to track with us over these last 5 years. And even if not, even if you missed some sermons along the way, I would love you to watch through this revisited Romans road where we take all of the big picture and we walk through all of Paul's ideas and thoughts as he lays them all out. One of the real problems with Romans, I think, is that a lot of preachers come along and they preach verses. And verses out of their context can say a lot of different things. But in the big picture of everything that's going on in Paul's life, everything's happening in the city of Rome, and everything Paul is moving through in his movements of this letter, I think we get to see a very different picture of who Paul was and what Paul invites us toward, particularly as we encounter the faithfulness of Christ that comes to find us in our lives today.